Hello, this is Michael Gray with the Frequency Genome. So, the idea I want to talk with you all about today is why aren't we creating better humans? Before I do that, please like, comment, subscribe, give me some feedback, ask me some questions. Maybe I'll make you a video just like this one. So, why aren't we creating better humans? What do I mean by this? Well, when I say a better human, I have a very specific definition. I mean, creating people in three major charge directions. That is physically, like physical fitness, right? Which I would argue it has an effect on psychology, etc. Like they're not different things, and the fact that that isn't understood is a problem. But for this purposes, we'll talk in that way. So the physical fitness of human beings in general. Psychologically developed is the second charge direction. And the third is the psychophysical. And I'll define each one and then describe each one in more detail. So let me give you just a loose definition before I do all that. So physical, we can kind of understand. That's the physical layers and levels and physiological functioning of health at those layers and levels. And I would include that there are deeper layers and levels to the human physiology than modern science studies. The electrical system of the cells, the electrical system, right? There's these subtle energy bodies that are created that we can now measure off of the heart, the gut, the brain, and other places, and treating all cells and the tissues as an energy body as well. Okay, that's very important. Like our basic model is retarded, and I mean that by the literal definition of it. And psychology, what I mean by that is our we have parts, we have all these different layers and levels, aspects of self, etc., that we're starting to understand. But an oversimplification of all that is this idea of object permanence and the number of perspectives you can take simultaneously and integrate and have the capacity to emotionally feel those. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Well, that exactly. And that determines your level of psychological worldview using spiral dynamics, and that spiral is a never-ending spiral, and it fluctuates and so forth and so on, all the things that are associated with that. So we're not reaching a high enough level in the mass populations to get out of the first tier of psychological development such that we can see each other's perspectives, simply put. And that goes for all of our power structures that we build, our CEOs, et cetera, like our governmental leaders, like anyone, billionaires, et cetera. No one is really breaking into that second tier. Only a few limited number of the population is, and that limits the number of, that limits the capacity for the systems and problems that we solve. Okay? And yeah. And the way I think of that is neuronal grouping and the connection between the groups. Okay. And then the third part is like you have all these patterns, and then how much capacity you have for different areas of felt experience in the body and neuronal thought processes, conceptual thoughts, feelings, emotions, desires, embodied states. Right? That's basically your psychological development. And then on the psychophysiology, right, the third charge direction, what I mean by that is the integration of the two, where mind meets matter, right? And we can think of this in terms of just simple overall body coherence. That is how much coherence is in the heart, the brain, the heart, and vagal toning in the gut. Simple, right? And that'll allow you to be in the present moment, awake. And all three of these are interconnected, because the better your neurons are firing in a coherent state, the healthier the overall physiology is, the more relaxed responses you have, and the more capacity you have to feel uh, different embodied states and take them on simultaneously. It increases your capacity for emotional and psychological awareness, right? So it's kind of like it's the bond between the physical and the psychological development, the psychophysical, and when that happens, and you're there 24 hours a day, that's enlightenment, and you can measure that. You can put brain signals on the body. You can put electrodes on the body and measure that. Is the brain in some sort of alpha, gamma, theta, depending on what meditation or technique you use? Is that awareness there 24 hours a day? That underlying subjective sense of self. And then you have access to your subconscious and your dreams, etc. And that is actually being what I would say the baseline for being an awake human being. And I would say that we don't have less than 1% of 1% of human beings in and on the planet, right, are experiencing this. Okay, that's a problem. That's the underlying issue, I think, with all this. So let me explain that. And so we have many people who are very embodied throughout the day, right? Like if you go to a yoga class, or if you meet with a meditation teacher, or these people who have adopted these types of lifestyles, but it takes 20 to 30 years roughly, and just most people fall out by that time, right? Right, unless you live as a monk, it's just not happening for you mostly. Okay, so why is this not happening? So I would say that's the crux of the position: is our nervous systems aren't aligning into this psychophysiological state that allows us to both simultaneously be physically healthier and psychologically healthier, but allows us to psychologically develop at quicker rates of speed and interact with one another and so forth and so on. Because we no longer associate our thoughts, feelings, emotions, and desires as this exterior loop. So why is that not happening? And why does it take 20 to 30 years to get people online? Okay, so let's address that one first. What's happening is the planet's electromagnetic frequency has decreased over the last 5,000 years or so by 2/3. So it's a third as strong as it was 5,000 years ago, roughly. And you can get into the weeds and into the details on all that, but let's just assume that that's loosely happening. Well, this electromagnetic field affects all life, right? Like the plants use it to communicate. It affects animal behavior, and we're animals, right? We put on shoes, we've gone indoors, we've ungrounded ourselves. And so physically what's happened is the cells in our body are clumping. We're not getting enough sunlight, and the oxygen is decreased, right? The oxygen concentration is decreased on the planet. So what we have, this situation is where our physiologies are less healthy, right? And this electromagnetic force isn't grounding our cells, which isn't grounding the firing of our nervous system and our major nerve bundles in our body, and our gut, our heart, and our brain and spinal column, right? And you have some peripheral shit going on, right? And these loops get out of time when they're not coherent and in phase, right? The heart isn't fully communicating, the gut isn't fully communicating, and the brain isn't fully communicating. So these fields that should be being created on some like quantum mechanical, quicker interaction and things like that just aren't really fully turned on, and they're not online. And so it creates these little loops in your heart, gut, and brain, and these different personalities or these different parts of self aren't integrated and in phase with one another. And so you have the brain moving down to a lower capacity into a survival mode, going thoughts, feelings, emotions, desires, right? Right? Predict the future, remember the past, right? And going through that cycle all day long. Now, it doesn't go that quick unless you have high anxiety or stress or something like that, but it's roughly that pattern. Something along those lines, loosely, right? Like thoughts, feelings, emotions. I feel this way, this thought, that, right? And it's just all over the place, and it's scattered, and there's no coherent story, and there's no integration of self, right? It's just not happening. because the brain isn't fully online. It's decoherent beta waves in waking state, right? And there's not this underlying capacity, and so we experience three different states of consciousness: waking, dreaming, and deep sleep. And there's not an underlying sense of self that is established throughout that. And that's enlightenment, right? But that's also the base physiological functioning of the body that it should be in. And it's not, because put on shoes, went indoors, and the Earth's electromagnetic frequency decreased. Okay? That's the main issue. You stack upon that people with lower capacity, right? Lower brain capacity, building systems such as financial systems based on constantly stealing energy away from one another. And then that type of mentality, right? A debt created enslavement system, essentially, was our current monetary system is then pushed into all avenues and all systems that we build, from our housing markets, from our media markets, from the medical industry, the food industry, right? Like, our doctors are just selling us things that aren't and they can't even see what's going on, right? And agriculture companies and food companies are just putting poison in the food and the water supply, and right. And so, like, all these little micro stresses, and then trying to keep up with the Joneses, and creating systems that aren't based around human psychology and physiology, but based around creating basically slaves for the state. You have a situation where people are just overworked, right? like we don't even know how to take care of ourselves, and so you have a situation where these systems just perpetuate on everyone, right? It's not that complicated. Like, it starts with the money supply, and then it builds into the governmental systems, and then it builds into the structures that people build at low levels of psychological development, and the energy exchange process of the money supply, and people are just doing too much for the capacity of their nervous systems because they're in a survival mode functioning. And then people start, cutting corners, and like, well, maybe if I put this in the food, and like, I can sell more money, and blah, 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 and I can, speed that process up. And it's at a low level of psychological, right? And you just see the system just get perpetuated out. And it's not against capitalism. It's not against communism. It's not an ism. It's just humanism, right? It's like a thing that at low capacity will build systems that hurt our fellow man, because we won't see ourselves in that level. So okay, so that's basically like what's going on the physical side, right? And also, I would argue that our bodies feed off of one another and our fields, and we're decoherently collapsing each other's fields constantly. And so you have this low energy state on the planet, and then you have people who are right, functioning from low levels, and then they have these energy fields, and they're just feeding off of one another, and they're stuck in this low level physiological functioning, which affects their ability to psychologically evolve, their ability to build systems that, right? Because your psychological development will determine the system that you can build and the structures and things that you'll build. And then the psychophysiology isn't turned on, right? Because what happens when you turn that on fully is your gates of perception start changing. So when this is coherent, the heart's coherent, and the gut's coherent, you start to change the reality you experience and see directly. That is the localization of self, whether it's in the heart, gut, or brain, because it seems to be in one of those major nerve bundles when you get people to close their eyes and say, "Where are you?" That changes when those signals become coherent. And it usually moves to someplace up here. It can be somewhere else, but it's usually here, especially in males. And they begin to see themselves as some larger awareness witnessing the body, like a high level flow state when you have hyperfrontality, but it's something else that's occurring. It's more of a global coherence in the frontal lobe of the brain versus this localized part. And so what ends up happening is they do that 24 hours a day, right? Like, sense of self is there. And like ketosis, it turns on some sort of psychotropic chemical that is how you once were burning on a different set of chemicals. You in ketosis, you were burning on ketones and things like that, or sorry, you burn on glucose and then you switch over to ketones in ketosis. Something similar happens when you get these electrical coherence. You start to generate higher levels of DMT and other psychotropics, and this starts to change your localized sense of self. You start to identify some non-localized sense of self. Time starts to be in the present moment. We start to see time closer to the reality that it actually is versus these lower structured networks of time that we build in our brain currently. Right? And then you move into this capacity where you start to identify with the heart. The heart starts to expand. You start to see yellow in objects. That's the DMT having an effect on the pineal gland. And then you start to have this pareidolia effect where you start to hallucinate your inner subjective subconscious into the environment, a full-blown trip. Then that goes away, and you end up with this capacity to see yourself as just an infinite point, or one point in a series of infinite points, and you see yourself as everything, right? You become one with everything. This is this oneness experience outwardly. A lot of people have it inwardly. This is outward expression of it, and it's a high functioning of the psychophysiology. And what ends up happening is it's too hard to sustain. The electrical field is not strong enough, and people are constantly measuring you, and you're constantly being micro-poisoned. So these stresses on the physiology usually bring people back down. They think they saw God or something, but it's just ideal physiological functioning. And for the first time, right, you're actually able to see the reality or something closer to the reality around us instead of this hallucination of low bandwidth that we're rendering. Okay? And so people aren't getting there, number one, because we don't know about it. It's in all of our ancient books, but it's jaded, and the people who tell the stories of it aren't experiencing it. They don't know what the fuck they're talking about in the short run. Like your preacher doesn't know. Like there's only a very small number of people on the planet who've actually been able to experience that without drug induction. Right now, you can do it with high level doses of various psychotropics, mainly DMT. Is androgynous DMT is the closest that your body gets to produce it. And so I went through these experiences years ago naturally, and then I've been reproducing them with psychedelics. So okay, so why aren't they doing that? Right? Like that's kind of why people aren't doing it. Like this is why people's physical bodies aren't healthy, because we're exercising. We're not exercising. We're indoors. We're not getting the grounding effect, and we're just poisoning ourselves. And we've built these low capacity systems and social systems that don't support overall psychological, physiological health. Right? It's pretty straightforward, and our nervous system isn't fully turned on. Okay, so how do we fix that? Well, here's what I can tell you. This is the thing that I call like the World Suffering Index or something along that line. If you could think of everyone's nervous system simultaneously, if you had a map of it, and you were like, okay, what is causing the most harm in people? Well, usually it's people's imagination, right? Like you can map it out and you can see that most suffering is happening. And then you say, okay, where does suffering come from, and where does trauma and these types of things come from? So like let's break down what trauma is and where it comes from. So essentially what we have is, say you have like a 45-year-old male like myself, and you 44, but whatever. And so you say 45 sounds better, right? And so you go, okay, where is his trauma coming from? Well, trauma, let's make up a simple definition. Over the last 16 months, we have something, an event or life thing that had happened, a behavior, something that that won't go away. It's a persisting thought, feeling, emotion cycle, and it's having an effect on my behavior, my capacity, etc. That's a trauma. Okay, oversimplified, not clear, but you get it, right? And so we can deal with that immediate trauma. Okay, I'll go back through how you deal with these, but let me just explain the map. So that's a trauma, and then we have basic life cycles. So that's happening on some neuronal process stored at some layered level. This is oversimplified, incorrect understanding all of this mostly is, but just follow me. And so so let's just say we have like depths of neurons. Let's just say that those 16 months are here. And then we'll have like three major cycles of the human being. You'll have between 25 when the brain is fully developed, down to 12, when the hormones kick in, right? And we'll say that that is where you're developing your public self, right? Or something like that, using Busamante's CIA oversimplification of psychology. And so you'll have some traumas in there. And those will determine a particular set of behaviors and patterns. And then below that, you'll have between 12 and 7. And so we'll say that's like your public self, or something that you share with other people who are very close to you. And then you have like your secret self between 0 and 7, where you were in theta state. And this is where the problem is actually built. So all that's really an incorrect model, but whatever. Between 0 and 7 is where the deep wiring is, because you were absorbing more in theta state. And so you have some deep patterning. So basically what's happening is the patterning is getting deeper and deeper and deeper. Okay. And then below that, you have in utero programming. So that's the shit you took on from your mother, and the environment that was happening to her, and her translation into you, and that sub programming that's happening. And we're just now starting to understand that. Okay. But it's very clear that happens. And so, like, when people eat psychedelics, they'll go into these experiences like, I was in the womb and like this dude was stabbing, like whatever's going on, right? But like, this is these are the phases of suffering, right, or of trauma, we could say. And then what you have is like, they've been able to show like 14, I think it's 14, whatever, why 14, I don't know, but 14 generations of trauma being stored in the DNA. Right. And so that's what we know. Right. And so then you have behavioral patterns and cycles and like all these weird things that aren't even your fault. Right. Like, that you haven't even experienced, that are running you. And then I would argue there's some collective unconscious trauma and ancestral trauma, etc., and things that are happening outside of the capacity of our models for modern science, right? They're happening. Like things like past lives, angelic beings, like all this weird stuff that happens in the subconscious, and multidimensional interplanetary trauma things that are happening. Okay. And we'll just put that into abstract trauma. We'll just say all that's abstract trauma, and it shows up in various patterns, and we can say those patterns may or may not be real, right? That's fine, but they're definitely experienced, and they're having some effect. Okay, so now how do we deal with this? Okay, let's go all the way back up to that 16-month cycle. Well, what you need to do is you need to be able to deal with at least that 16-month cycle. So how do you do that? Well, we already talked about why the body is susceptible to trauma. It's because the electromagnetic forces in the body, and cellular health, and overall psychophysiological health of coherence is low. And then that has an effect on chemicals and so forth and so on. And then, right, and then that limits its capacity for psychological development and so forth and so on, right? And so what you need to do is that. You need to put the body into a coherent state as possible, right? And as healthy state as possible on a regular, and go in and psychologically rewire and reassess. Okay? So let me explain. So like, what happens is when you get that coherence, you produce those psychotropic chemicals. It opens up these fields in the body and so forth and so on. It allows for what we call quantum healing. Okay? And so what we want to do is put the body in an ideal physiological state through diet, exercise, biohacking, etc., and then induce a limited amount of psychedelics and run people through the layers and levels of physiological functioning and psychological capacity to open up psychological capacity on these layers and levels to heal and to release those stresses and to rewire those neurons at a quicker rate of speed using the psychedelics, right? Like all these different techniques, putting the brain back into theta, right, through binaural beats, putting the body into a float tank so that the body's in theta and can heal and is completely relaxed, and then running people through psychological techniques that hit layers and levels of the body. So, what are those layers and levels? Well, establishing that reference frame of coherence, I call that the gray point, and then building capacity into breath rates, and then into the different neuronal bundles, dealing with three brains. So you go and you open up these dialogues and you rewire, right? You open up these conversations because we're disconnected in the brain, the heart, and the gut. And then you integrate on the different layers and levels of the psychophysiology of the issues in the tissues, doing body scans and somatic scannings of the body, right? And then you move into the psychic energy system, right? Like all these different energy systems of the body, the cellular level, the muscular level, the bone level, right? Feeling all these different layers and levels of the physiology, like Alex Gray's paintings of the sacred mirrors. If you go around and do those body scans, right, you're doing that in your own mind's eye and allowing these emotional bodies, the mental body, the physical body, right? And so you're clearing out trauma at those different layers and levels. And then there's this cosmic, right? So that'll clear out and get you to stored memories, right? Once you get like down into the gut, you'll move past those capacities in the developmental years, like I don't know what you call those years, teenage years. It's not the right adolescent, I think it's called. And then you would move down into like the 0 to 7 years, and you'll start to remember and pull these issues out of the tissues and rewiring and reframing. And eventually you'll get into the womb and you'll start getting deeper down into these layers and levels. And then you'll start to reset this blueprint of the stresses, and you can start to filter out this cosmic DNA or ancestral DNA, and all these abstract things that I was talking about start to show up. So it's a series of putting the body in an ideal state. So you go through about 11 biohacking stations, 6 weeks prep where you learn all these different techniques, breath work, start microdosing, and then come for a 3-day thing. So you learn like breath work, meditation, like you learn all those things in that 6-week period. And I was talking about all those techniques and how to use all these technologies, float tanks, hyperbaric chambers, saunas, cold baths, etc., so that we can regulate the physiology. And then in a 3-day window, we run you through those capacities, right? Through all those techniques. You train for about 3 or 4 hours. Then we induce a medium dose of psychedelics and can regulate that by upregulating your adrenals and changing the frequencies to upregulate and downregulate as needed, and allow you to explore these different layers and levels of the physiology. And then you come out, right? Do it again to heal the body, and then you do a 6-week integration process. And so for about over, a 12-week process, 3 months, you've been able to realign, understand all these layers and levels of the physiology, et cetera. Okay, and to realign them. Now, does that heal it? No, it doesn't heal it. It probably will do more for you than I would argue large dose psilocybin or fucking MDMA, whatever that's worth. And then like maybe I shouldn't go into all that, and ayahuasca and all that, like, because it allows you to train more often. So you could do this like every quarter, and you would be turning back the time on that 16-month phase, and then getting rid of these layers and levels of trauma that I'm talking about, and moving up the psychological scale and moving into more solid physiological functioning and coherence, right? And so that's kind of the idea behind this, the ideal psychedelic container that I'm talking about. And so what I'm saying is the reason we're not evolving, or the reason we're not creating growing psychologically evolved human beings who are physically fit, psychologically fit and psychophysiologically functioning in a state of coherence is because we haven't created the environment for that to happen. And that's what the Ideal Psychedelic Container is designed to do. If you like this video, please like, comment, subscribe, give me some feedback, ask questions. Maybe I'll make you a video like this one. Once again, this is Michael Gray, Frequency Genome Project, reminding you, expand awareness, not die, ride the vibe. Have a good one.